Welcome to Chapter 9, Lesson 1, Patterns and Graphs. Today we're going to talk about how to graph data and how to use those graphs to make predictions. First off, in your notes I gave you space, so if you look, you'll have this blank page underneath. Down in that blank page is where you can draw your graph. That way you don't have to squeeze it into the side over here. Alright, so the first thing when we're talking about creating a graph, the first thing we need to do is find the intervals that we're going to use. So in this case, when we find the intervals, we have to look at first our independent values. These aren't going to change. Okay? These are our dependent values because they depend on how many yards we have. So in this case, our dependent value is going to go on the up by 1, since each of these goes up by 1. Right, so down here on our x-axis, we go by 1, go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with 0 being over here. Now our next interval, okay, since 180 is the largest, we need to be able to fit from 0 to 180 on this graph as a whole. So we have to find a compatible number with 180 to find an interval that works. I took 180 and divided it by 9, so I could use 20s. So on my y-axis, every interval is going to go up by 20. So I have 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 140, 160, 180. Now, you don't have to label each of them. Like you'll notice here, I don't have a 20, I don't have a 60, but you need to make sure to leave that space for that interval. It's still an interval of 20 because from line to line it's 20. You're just not labeling each of them, and that is okay. The next thing that you need to do is you need to plot your data. Okay, so in this case, when we plot our data, we look at 1 yard, gives us 36 inches. So I take 1 yard and I go up to 36 inches. Now this isn't perfect because we're not going up by ones, so we want to make sure we're a little bit over half, okay, closer to 40 than we would be to 20. Same thing, 2 yards gives me 72 inches. 3 yards gives me 108 inches. 4 gives me 144, and 5 yards gives me 180. Now that I've plotted my data, the next thing I have to make sure to do is to label and title. This is very important. If you do not put a label and title on your graph, you lose points and nobody knows what your graph is about. So in this case, my labels would be inches because this is how many inches there are, and down here it would be yards because these stand for the number of yards we're working with. And the label of my graph, or the title of my graph, is yards to inches. That way I know when I'm looking at this graph is telling me if I'm converting from yards to inches what it's going to be. It doesn't have to be an elaborate title, it just has to make sure that it has the important information in it. Alright, next we're going to talk about how to use the graph to make an estimate. You have this graph in your notes, and you're going to take a look and say, alright, about how much would it cost to rent a watercraft for 3.5 hours? I know that for 1 hour it cost me $100. Right, so that's important. I would want to possibly write that down. So I go up here, 1 hour was $100. For 2 hours, it cost me $200. And then for 3 hours, it cost me $300. So I know, I can tell from my graph that per hour, it's $100. Okay, so that's right here. Or 1. So now I want to figure out if I'm going to have it for 3.5 hours, how much would that be? Well, since I'm going to have it for an extra 30 minutes, I want to figure out if I'm using half the time, I should probably figure out what half of that cost is going to be. So if 1 hour means I have to pay $100, I'm going to take that hour and I'm going to split it in half. And I know that gives me 30 minutes. So there's my half hour. But what I do to the top, I have to do to the bottom. And I know that instead of being $100, it's going to be $50. So I can estimate that for 3.5 hours, it's going to cost me the $300 for the 3 hours plus the $50 for the half hour. So I'm guessing that it's going to cost me about $350 to rent the watercraft for 3.5 hours. Most of us could look at the graph and say, okay, it's going up at a rate of $100 per hour, and then just see that we're going to be at about $350 when we get to that 3.5 mark. This is just the math that goes along with that. And again, it's just an estimate because they don't tell you for sure that they give you half-an-hour rates. All right, and last, use the graph to make a prediction. So this graph here shows the relationship between Celsius and Fahrenheit. Use the graph to make a prediction of what 160 degrees Fahrenheit is in Celsius. So this is what I want you to do. I want you to take a look at the graph, and on Edmodo, I want you to post, so this is going to be your only problem. Okay, 160 degrees Fahrenheit is equal to, and then you need to tell me what you think, what estimate you're making for degrees Celsius. When you come to class the next day, you need to be prepared to defend your answer. Again, if you have any questions, make sure to write them down or to post them on Edmodo.